Hi everyone, we're back with our special guest Joseph. Hi Joseph.
Hello.
How are you doing this fine day?
I'm good. I am good. The sun was out. It felt like the last sun of summer.
So we are going to be talking about A Canticle for Leibowitz, which we just read together this summer. Speaking of summer, this is a science fiction classic by oh dear, I've already forgot his name. Walter
Walter Miller.
Walter Miller Jr.
Walter Miller Jr. Yeah.
Yes. Do you want to tell us what this book is about?
Yes. Right. So, context for us reading this, similar to Piranesi, we were looking for genre fiction, but Piranesi wasn't a great success. So I said we should read A Canticle for Leibowitz, very thoughtful genre fiction. So A Canticle for Leibowitz, Walter Miller fought in World War II, right? He was part of a bombing crew. And the bombing crew he was a part of destroyed a monastery in Italy, I believe. So Walter Miller Jr. came back, from World War II, and the setting in which he's writing this, as in what's going on in the world as he's writing A Canticle for Leibowitz, is obviously Cold War. Lots of talk about nuclear discussion and annihilation and war. Nuclear discussion. That must be very, very hot. Yeah. So there's fear of nuclear war. He's fought in a war. And he converted to Catholicism, I believe, and so there's a lot of guilt. And so he wrote a series of short stories about a monastery set in the aftermath of a nuclear war. So this is post-apocalyptic fiction. It's pretty early example though of post-apocalyptic sci-fi because it came out the stories were first published in the 50s. Yeah, 50s. And then the short stories, which are all set, they all tell the story of this abbey throughout various stages of its development. They were compiled into a single book that had some, editing to make the whole thing kind of cohere as a novel. And that is A Canticle for Leibowitz. So it's a group of monks, and they are basically trying to preserve technology from before the nuclear war for some future civilization to rediscover and get use from. So it's it's post-apocalyptic. It's very religious, and it's pretty atypical for post-apocalyptic fiction. Yeah. So and we read this book, and you'd never read this book before, had you?
No, I remember you had mentioned it quite a while ago, and I added it to my never-ending list of books to read, and always meant to get to it, but just didn't. So it was fun reading it together, and I think
Yeah.
that you mentioned it got better on the third reading than the previous two.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, as context, I have read this book twice before. Once was about 10 years ago. I was doing my undergrad at uni, and then I reread it last year and spoke to you about it then, actually, didn't I?
Yes. Well, we were going to talk about the things that make A Canticle for Leibowitz unique in science fiction, because even though we chose a book that's genre fiction and everything, it really stretches the limits of its genre, I would say. And there were certainly things that we thought made it unique compared to other science
Yeah.
fiction stories. So, do we want
It's
to?
another list video. It's another list video.
Yes.
But not good and bad this time. Just what
No,
makes it distinct.
that's right. So, I mean, I guess I'll start. I mean, the first thing that you already mentioned is it's a religious book, right? It's a very Catholic
Yeah.
book. Uh,
The most Catholic book I've read, I think.
I mean, I have read one previous dystopian novel, Lord of the World, by Benson, who's Catholic, and that's even more niche. But apart from that, I don't think I've read a book this Catholic that also is science fiction, post-apocalyptic, and dystopian. So,
A lot of qualifiers.
yeah, and yet the Catholic aspect of it is pretty significant. I mean, you already mentioned it focuses on a group of monks in different points in time, and it takes place at this abbey. All three stories take place at this abbey, which becomes, kind of the grounding center of the book, and symbolic of the beliefs that ground the characters, even as the Abbey's influence and power dwindles through the ages. This this faith that they have and the structure of their little society keeps them together, and it's just prominent. And not just that, but all of the politics of the Catholic Church in this story is
Yeah.
is a huge focus of the book. Yeah. Did you have anything
Yeah.
to?
So
Yeah.
mine is very my first one is very related to that.
Mm-hmm.
Which is that this book has a really distinct worldview, right? Which so I don't just mean that it's Catholic. I mean it is Catholic. That's kind of what I'm talking about. But I think a lot of sci-fi, sci-fi often has lots of moral considerations and can be quite philosophical. But I think it's rare for sci-fi authors to really commit to a worldview, right? And most sci-fi authors normally come from kind of a vague sort of secular humanist worldview, which is fine, but I think sometimes sci-fi can feel like really homogenous in the kind of views you have expressed, whereas some of the great works of literature often challenges really meaningfully. So this book is Catholic, and it's not just apologetically Catholic. This book is like triumphantly Catholic.
Mm-hmm.
All its characters are super Catholic, and it makes no apologies about it. I don't think it's like overwhelming, like didactic and beating you on the head with its Catholicism, but it just feels like it's written for a Catholic audience. And I feel like maybe I don't know about you, but I feel like sometimes there were some things I didn't always catch on to that I didn't properly understand because I'm not entirely Catholic. But I just really enjoyed that it doesn't feel like any other sci-fi novel I've read. That a lot of its concerns are just very particular to it being Catholic, and so it just makes for a fun read, right? It makes for a fun read. I feel like I learned some stuff about Catholicism along the way. It didn't feel like anything else I've read, and I just kind of like that the whole thing is kind of an argument for a Catholic worldview. And I'm not Catholic, and I don't want to be Catholic, but I like that it argues for a Catholic worldview because that's just different and interesting.
Yes. I mean, I mentioned Lore of the World, but yeah, that's the only other book I've noticed that does this, and that was written by a priest, whereas this book was written by a layperson. But he nevertheless gets really intricate with, talking about how the process for canonization is happening with
Yeah,
Leibowitz, this mystical Leibowitz, and just a bunch of things.
genuinely interesting stuff.
It is interesting.
Genuinely interesting.
Yeah, he's not afraid to go into those details that might scare away the average reader, I guess.
Yeah. And I think what I really like about it though is it's not just like he wasn't just like, oh, I'm gonna write a Catholic book, but like he was a Catholic, and you really sense the guilt he felt over being implicated in the destruction of this monastery in World War II. There's a real sense of guilt about the book. I mean, in a very general sense, like how is humanity in this situation where we have nuclear weapons and so forth? Because the book is fundamentally about nuclear war. But there's a real just a sense of guilt, like the whole book is some kind of penance for his past sins, which weighs heavily on the book. And I really like that because it is very Catholic, but that feels very personal to him. And who Walter Miller is. I mean, I'm projecting a little bit. I don't know who he is, but yeah, sorry. That was my first point.
Yeah, it's almost like, well, and that kind of leads me to one of my other points is along with the religious aspect, I think the human drama here, the relationships in and around the Abbey carry just a lot of weight to them that, I don't know, sometimes I'll read or watch a science fiction film and you feel like the main characters are somehow playing for very high stakes and they're like in the middle of these really high profile challenges that are on the world stage. But I don't know. I mean, the people at the Abbey do interact with major scientists and stuff of their time, but at the same time, it feels a little bit more concerned with the monks and their relationships to each other, especially in the first two books, I think, where you've got the young Brother Francis, trying to get to a point where the abbot will allow him to become, you know, fully admitted into the order and everything. I guess, yeah, that was just something I noticed, is I felt like this smaller human drama has more focus than I've seen in some other science fiction.
Yeah, I think you touched on there as well, probably what my second one is, which is that. So I think I didn't probably explain. So the book is not just set in one time because it's three short stories. The short stories were written in distinct periods. Like one is sort of written not that like 100, 200 years after the nuclear war, and it's kind of a Middle Ages setting. Then there's a few hundred years skip, and then there's a few hundred years skip. And each time we see like there's a jump forward in history and technology of this this post-apocalyptic civilization. What I really like about that is that, as you say, the because we jump ahead so far each time, we get to see the development of the world. But the way that it happens by, we just go from one story to the next. And as you say, each story is focusing on just the characters. And there's like a very organic way of revealing the progress in the world and what's going on. By just, things have changed and they're just interacting with their world and you just see that. And so I really like the time skips. And I think they're what really allow, what you say to be true, in that both the book can focus on particular characters and their kind of boring everyday concerns, but by skipping forward in time, we also get the big picture. And I think I know time skips aren't new in fiction. Time skips are done in all sorts of books, but I don't think I've seen it used so dramatically and to such just to such
Mm-hmm.
effect. Like it's very effectual, and I think it's one of the reasons the book works well, in my opinion.
Do you think the three stories, because they were published separately, do you think they would work as standalone stories then? I mean,
Um,
I kind of thought they would, but
I think no, no. I
oh
I
no.
think I think the first one, the so when I first read through, I felt like sometimes there was a disconnect and between the stories. I mean, there are a disconnect because they're three short stories. They were written as three short stories, right? But I think the first one really seeks to help you understand the abbey, how it works, the community, and what the mission of the monks is. You know,
Hmm.
and it sets up a lot of the themes that will be explored later in the book, or some of the ideas that might be torn down. And I think the first one could perfectly well work on its own, but I think the second and third one would be much less for being read in isolation.
Well, and something you mentioned I didn't write down, but yeah, it feels very organic the way the novel progresses, and I didn't struggle so much with like large chunks of exposition. I don't think he does that much. Like there's a few parts where he
Yeah,
explains the necessary context, but it goes along at a pretty good clip, and he just reveals things in a more natural way, which is something that
yeah,
I I felt was missing in certain other
yeah.
books I read,
A
like
lot,
Dune. Anyways,
lots of hard sci-fi is written for people, by people, and for people who really just enjoy long exposition. And that's no hate on those people, because they just want as much world building detail as possible. But it's an acquired
yeah,
taste. um, I
exactly.
You do get more in the third part of this book, but you feel by then he's kind of earned, he's earned the space to indulge. Okay, well,
Funny too.
go on.
Oh, so I guess for my next one, I that kind of leads into that. I think the book benefits from being told in third person because these characters seem very concerned about preserving knowledge
Yeah,
and to excruciating detail. So it's good it wasn't told in first person. It'd probably be twice as long. But I felt like the technology discoveries or rediscoveries in this book weren't necessarily the center. I think the center of the book was more about preserving knowledge and learning, if that makes sense, and preserving beliefs too, especially as the book went on. I don't think the technology itself had as much of that
yeah.
wow factor or focus as you find in other science fiction.
I I think it's relevant, but I think it's mainly just used. I yesterday was saying, and I suppose this is sort of a third point for me. I feel there's a certain mythical quality about the book, and mythical in the sense that certain philosophers like Nietzsche use it. Which is more that lots of things stand in for other things. You know, there's lots of archetypal things, and so in the second book, there's this whole thing about the creation of a light bulb. You know, that's a big story arc. I don't think that's a
Hmm.
spoiler. Um, but it, you know, it kind of and then there's one of the scientists from outside, and there's like this, you know, there's a bit of conflict over the preserved knowledge versus the new knowledge that's coming up. And I think you know, there's a big exploration in the book is like the relationship between technology and the state, how technology empowers the state, but how technology requires the state to be created, preserved, made, you know, proliferated. Um, and so I think technology matters, but it's not like a fetishistic interest in technology. It's not just like woo spaceships, big
Right.
spaceships. It's like
Exactly.
it's more interested in the idea of technology, what it represents, what it does.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
which is cool. What's your fourth thing?
I mean, I think you just kind of alluded to my fourth thing, which was the mythical side of the book. So on the one hand, they're trying to preserve these discoveries and things and make copies of the knowledge they have. On the other hand, there's these relics, right, that keep coming up, relics of the past, and the way that those relics, like their meaning changes over time, or it becomes more vague what 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 they represent or who they're from. Um, I guess not so much on the relic side, but in the mystical side of things, there's this character in the first part that appears to young brother Francis, and Francis gets in trouble because there's this rumor that starts that maybe this old man that appears to him is actually a vision of Leibowitz, and so
Leibowitz
there's this
is
whole
the
little
saint of he's the patron saint of the abbey.
yeah. So there's this whole drama that starts at the Abbey about whether or not Francis saw this apparition, and Francis gets in trouble for even talking about it, and it delays his orders, and it's just it's kind of a comedy, but at the same time, the book, and it does this in other parts of the book too, but just just shows you how history and how memories change as they change hands and as time goes on, and you don't really quite know what that relic is from, but you know it's important and worth preserving for some reason. So I don't
Yeah,
know.
that's very true. That's very true. Um, so that leads on to my fourth point, which is the satirical tone. Um, Plenty of funny sci-fi exists, right? Plenty of humorous sci-fi. But when I have gone back in the past and read some of like the sci-fi classics, because this is considered like, I don't know, it won all, you know, it won all the awards in the 60s. It's quote unquote classic sci-fi in that if you were a really sci-fi nerd, you probably have heard of this. Good chance you read it. Um, and when I go back and read them, I feel like a lot of sci-fi, and especially from around the time, is really self-serious, you know. And sci-fi is a
Hmm.
pretty self-serious genre. You know, you alluded to Dune earlier. Like Dune is a serious book. It's full of serious ideas. Um,
Yeah.
and like to be clear, like A Canticle for Leibowitz it gets serious and it has a lot of serious ideas, but fundamentally it's a humorous book. Um, and I mean sometimes perhaps to its own detriment of exploring its own ideas. But it's a humorous book first and foremost. It's designed to be a page turner and a crowd pleaser. And when it goes to explore its themes, it's really earned that right. You know, by the third of the short stories is definitely the most poetic, I would say. Um, but it's really earned the poetry by then. You know, it's pulled you along. It's given you a lot of good cheer, and so I think you're much more partial to it, um, taking, you know, to indulging itself. But I really like the satirical tone, and I was saying it's a Catholic book, but I think what makes it bearable, I think if it was just the most Catholic book you've ever read, I'm sure we've come across some insufferable Catholics in our lives, all of us. But what makes it bearable is that it mocks Catholicism a lot. I feel like it sets up this whole idea of this abbey, but fundamentally there's a lot of kind of satire over this idea of a bunch of monks. It's a funny premise, a bunch of monks preserving technology that they don't really understand in a post-apocalyptic future. That's a funny premise. And it rolls with that really well. And there's a lot of satire just about, being Catholic, the life of the life of
Hmm.
Catholicism, and all these things. And it sometimes you can't tell, like, it is a Catholic book, absolutely a Catholic book, but sometimes
Yeah.
almost you feel like, man, it feels like Walter Miller Jr. has conflicting feelings about Catholicism because he really lambasts some parts of Catholicism. So yeah,
Yeah, I like that it doesn't take itself too seriously, and in that sense, it's Catholic in a more Chestertonian way than
yeah,
some of these more serious authors. Uh, and I guess, okay, the other point I wanted to make, which is really minor in a way, but it relates to this, is it's set in the American West, which to me is already hilarious. Because you've got the Empire of Denver, and
yeah,
you've got like this Texas country, and it
Texarkana.
just Texarkana. Uh, and I don't know, just something about the world powers being centered in the American Southwest just cracks me
Yeah,
up. So,
yeah, Imperial
uh,
World Powers. Yeah. um,
exactly.
I feel like, I mean, I'm not so familiar with the geography of that part of the world as well. The US is a really big country. So I think there were parts you were chuckling at that I wasn't always appreciating some of like the local geographical humor. But so okay, my last thing. I mean, I'm sure I could go on about this, but my last thing that I feel really makes it quite stand out, idiosyncratic, is I think the book dodges genre conventions and tropes really well. I mean, I think part of this, right, is the first mover advantage. You know, it post-apocalyptic fiction has been done to death in the last 60, 70 years. It's not the first post-apocalyptic or dystopia. It's not dystopia. It's post-apocalyptic. I don't think it's the first post-apocalyptic book ever. I'm sure there were ones before. Um, but it was feeling a lot more. That genre was feeling a lot more fresh and
Hmm.
pertinent in the 1960s. Sometimes now it feels like I don't know. I don't worry about nuclear war every day, but Walter Miller Jr. I might have. I imagine many people back then. He lived through the
Hmm.
Cuban Missile Crisis. Many people back then it was
Yeah.
much more on their mind. And I think that there's a sense, I wouldn't say urgency, um, but it's kind of just taken for granted that nuclear war is a given once nuclear weapons exist. It's serious and imminent and like a specter, like a pall of death. So it's being beaten to death, but then it felt serious. I feel, and there's not as much there. It wasn't beaten to death, so it avoids many of the conventions just because the conventions didn't exist yet. It avoids many of the tropes because the tropes didn't exist yet, and it coined some tropes and some things itself. But the way it does everything is just very fresh, very well realized.
Yeah, you definitely feel that greater sense of urgency about nuclear war in the book. And the somberness of the last part in particular was just very, very moving. I mean, because it feels like it could happen to the author and to the characters in the book. And now we're looking back and we're like, yeah, we've passed that crisis point
Probably, hopefully,
decades ago,
hopefully,
but
yeah.
hopefully we have other crises now we can focus on. But uh yeah, I totally agree on that one. Yeah.
I don't have anything more to say. Do you?
I don't think I have anything more to say. What was your rating for this one then?
Oh, I still hold it as a 4 star. I
Yeah.
think it's a really really good book, but I think just the tone can be a bit inconsistent. And I just don't find the first, as much as I enjoy the first two short stories, I don't think they're as strong as the third. But then again, I don't think the third would stand well on its own. So yeah,
Hmm.
um, it's also, I think sometimes it appears more profound than it is. I really like the book, but I think sometimes some of the ideas might not make as much sense as they might
Hmm.
appear. Like it has lots of metaphors and stuff, but yeah. What's your rating?
I I also gave it a 4 in the end because I think where it gets like the balance of humor and seriousness is pretty good, I think. And when it gets very serious, there's just some amazing passages that I have not encountered before in other works that just really stuck with me.
Yeah, definitely parts where it's
I think
beautiful.
that yes, very beautiful. And I guess it's not quite a 5 for me because I think I was getting quite invested in the first part and hoping that the whole book would kind of go like flesh out the first part more, but it doesn't. It's not intended to. It's supposed to be 3 vignettes.
Yeah,
Um and that's fine, but I
I
think
I think there's this
it just
whole
spoke to me more.
yeah, I think there's this whole feeling to the book where it's kind of a happy accident. Like I think he set out to write some short stories that maybe weren't like as serious, and then they end up being good and got put together in a book. And I like it,
Hmm.
but it does. There's times where it feels a little bit cobbled together, and like maybe that's unfair. Maybe that's. I think there's times where it's just clear that it wasn't written as one grand vision. You know?
Yeah, well, that's the case for many great works of literature too. So it I think that's promising though. That means like if you have an idea, you should just go for it and not like worry too much
Yeah,
about
yeah.
you know how it pieces together. It'll get figured out eventually. So
Good, great.
yeah, thanks for joining me.
Thanks. No,
This
thanks
was
for having
great.
me. Good discussion. This wasn't a short one, but there we go.
Well, we'll see you again soon.
Bye.
Bye.